Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to this first of a series of virtual panel discussions that we're hosting this year at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge. The Institute for the Future of Knowledge is a cross-disciplinary ecosystem at the University of Johannesburg devoted to understanding the relationship between what we know and what will happen for the purpose of improving both. So that's our vision, our mission. And the future is obviously an ancient concern, but it's something that's become very current with advances in computational abilities that promise to improve predictive performance, and yet global events prove resiliently unpredictable. And the University of Johannesburg really established the IFK to further champion its future-oriented focus for South Africa and for the wider region. So this virtual panel came about really as a consequence of seeing a number of events relating to social media on the international stage. Recently, Twitter, Facebook, and Amazon all pulled support the support of their platforms for political activities stemming from the storming of the Capitol by Donald Trump supporters, not by Donald Trump himself, in January. And then in the same month, a row broke out about the relationship between Facebook and WhatsApp, about data sharing and privacy. And then another row broke out around the same time around an open letter, which a lot of academic philosophers signed, criticizing the decision to award an Order of the British Empire to Professor Kathleen Stock, who's with us today, who's a British philosopher. And large parts of both the campaigning and of the row took place on social media. And Stock noted that people believe what they read, which is something that worries not only Professor Stock, but also Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, and the World Health Organization, who coined the term infodemic to describe the rapid spread of unreliable information about COVID-19. So the proliferation of information on social media raises concerns about the role of power and misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and fake news, and puts pressure too on the concept of what knowledge is. What is the relationship between knowledge and the larger concept of information? Can information be wrong, or is it just more richness to add to a picture in which an agent is supposed to then come to their own conclusion? So that's the background for this panel discussion. And first of all, I'm going to talk to Dr. Mare, who is an associate professor and deputy head in the Department of Communication at the Namibia University of Science and Technology in Windhoek. He's also a senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg's Faculty of Humanities. His research interests include analyzing the intersection between technology and society, digital journalism, social media and politics, media and democracy, media and conflict, and the role of artificial intelligence in newsrooms. He currently leads the international research project on social media, misinformation, and elections in Kenya and Zimbabwe, funded by the Social Science Research Council. He's the co-author of Participatory Journalism in Africa, Digital News Engagement and User Agency in the South, published by Routledge this year, with Hayes Mwinda Mabwezara, and the co-editor of Media Conflict and Peacebuilding in Africa, Empirical and Conceptual Considerations, also published by Routledge this year, with Jacinta Maiwu. So, Mare, thank you for joining us and making time. I really appreciate it. Can we start by talking a bit about the link between power and information and whose information is disseminated? So how well do you think those without traditional power are able to gain more power through using social media? And does this actually help, or does it just create an illusion of more power?
Thanks a lot, Alex, for this invitation. And also want to thank our colleagues at IFK for this invitation. Certainly, it's a very good platform that you've created. Going back to your question, I would say that certainly the advent of social media has been heralded somehow in most mainstream literature. Is actually opening up space for counterpower, so to speak. So the assumption, therefore, is that ordinary people can all of a sudden be able to append the traditional power that we've often associated with states, political leaders, and also even traditional leaders, especially in an African context. But what we have also seen, especially over the last few years and also few months, is the idea of the concept platform power that has become very dominant nowadays. Because all of a sudden we've realized that these big, giant corporates that we have allowed to run our social media platforms have become too powerful to a point that they can actually be able to decide who speaks on their platform, who doesn't speak on their platform, who can belong on that platform, and what content gets taken out. And I think we have seen it with the issue of Donald Trump. And of late, we have seen what has also happened, especially in Australia, where media companies are actually pushing to say Google and Facebook and all these other platform companies must pay some kind of money because they are taking away advertising from this traditional media organization. So I would not say that it doesn't create an illusion of power. It does create some kind of power, which probably some would actually call counter power. But this power somehow, especially in a repressive environment, may not be enough to topple a regime or to actually bring democratization. And I think there are so many examples that we can talk about with regards to these issues. That's what I would say for now.
So in a sense, you're sort of saying it is a bit of an illusion. It's not an illusion in the sense that social media does create new sources of power, but what may be an illusion, or it may be unclear who holds those new sources of power. So you're suggesting that it's actually still large companies. Is that what you're arguing?
Certainly, I'm actually saying that actually what we are seeing is actually the concentration of power within global corporates like Facebook, Twitter, Google, that become very powerful as a result. Yes, it also allows it, just like any other technology, social media amplifies existing social processes. So it actually, for example, if it's used in a country where there is dictatorship, chances are that people in that particular society may try to use it actually to fight back against that dictatorship. So essentially, that's what we've seen, for example, in countries like Uganda, Zimbabwe, and in Cameroon of late, we've also seen how these people are using this particular media. But at the end of the day, in as much as they can make a lot of noise, or what we actually, some scholars actually call clicktivism, where you are clicking online. If you don't match that with also offline mobilization, we have seen that most of these protests actually suffer still deaths. And I think that's what we've seen in most countries, especially in Africa. But in some instances, of course, it has helped social process, for example, in Egypt, in Tunisia, especially in 2010 and 2011. But of course, we know some of the transitions that actually happened there were not really a transition that they expected.
Yeah, I was wondering about the Arab Spring and the role of social media in that. And the other thing I was wondering about was, in South Africa, the Fees Must Fall movement, of course, it's a hashtag movement, which is very interesting. And that did translate into real live protests. So people were using social media to organize. I wonder whether, that of course, is happening in a context in which there are already a lot of protests. So one might argue that if social media isn't causing the protests in those cases, it's just a new vehicle for organization. I wonder whether that's the case in these other contexts. The question of the American context is interesting as well. Do you think there's a significant difference between the way that social media might function in relation to power and organization there compared to in, say, an African country? I'm wondering, for example, whether the interests of a company like Facebook or Google might be rather different in who runs Uganda compared to who runs America.
I agree with you there that certainly when Facebook deals with political leaders in America and the way how probably they would deal with political leaders in Africa would certainly be different. Because I think one thing that we've also seen in the last few years is that African governments that have got these dictatorial tendencies have actually started shutting down the internet. And I think that has been one of the major trump cards that have been used by dictators actually in Africa to say, okay, if we get to elections, we just switch off the internet. And by switching off the internet, essentially in Africa, we are saying we are switching off the social media because the internet here in Africa is actually consumed and actually, and you engage with it through social media, essentially. Most of the people that actually talk about the internet, they talk about social media, not the internet as a full bundle as we know it. So I would say that, and we saw what Facebook and Twitter did to Donald Trump, that these global corporates actually have got a lot of power that they can actually be able to do, to actually push a certain kind of an agenda and actually push out a very powerful president out of their platforms, and there are no consequences. But if they do that in Africa here, certainly what politicians often do, obviously, they would probably say, okay, we make sure that you don't operate in our environment, or they'll probably find a route through which they can actually be able to punish you. But of course, the other issue that also comes in here is that Facebook probably would not really see a lot of political economic gains through probably investing there in Zimbabwe or in Uganda, because really in terms of the adverts that come out of there, probably they're insignificant compared to what actually comes from countries like the UK or the US, for example.
What are your thoughts about conflict and peace building? I mean, do you think that social media is a force for creating or conflicts or quelling them, or both, or neither?
I would say that. Okay. I would say that, as I have already pointed out, I would say that I think I still hold the view that we need to look at social media as a double-edged sword. In as much as it can actually help us to build peace, it can also be used to break that same peace. And I think we are in that kind of an environment where we are seeing increasingly in some societies, actually social media actually being used to fan a conflict and actually propagate hate speech and other ills that can actually lead to conflict. So in that kind of an environment, you are increasingly seeing social media being used as a tool actually to foment conflict. But in some instances where there's a push towards peace building, increasingly we are also seeing ordinary people, but also civil society actually using these platforms to build peace. But I would give an example of a context like Zimbabwe, which is a highly polarized and highly charged political environment, where increasingly what you are seeing there is that social media increasingly is actually being used to create more conflict rather than actually to bring contending political forces together. Actually, what you are seeing is more polarization. And that polarization that you see on social media is an indicator of what actually obtains offline. So essentially, it becomes an amplifier of existing polarization that actually obtains in offline spaces.
So that's interesting, because obviously social media is famous for two things in the sort of public consciousness. One is bubbles, where people only talk to people who agree with each other. And the other is polarization, where people become more extreme. And then the consequence is that when people do encounter people outside their bubble, they're less likely to reach a common ground. So you're saying that certainly in the Zimbabwean context, that seems to actually translate into an offline political problem in a way. I mean, I suppose one question would be whether, in a context like Zimbabwe, where I suppose that the question is, does one see it as a bad thing or a good thing if one is on the side of the underdog, as it were, and one thinks that there's a legitimate building of support to push against a repressive regime, one might see the creation of conflict in that context as a good thing. I'm not saying it is. I'm just trying to get a handle on what the difference is between, on the one hand, a sort of bad polarization, quote unquote, on the other hand, potentially desirable mobilization.
Yeah, you are raising a very pertinent issue there, where we have to say, how do we make sense of this polarization? Is it bad or good for democratization? Because in some cases, obviously, from an opposition point of view, that kind of polarization, if it leads to mobilization, then it's good. But for nation building, I would say for nation building, ultimately, that kind of polarization creates a situation where it becomes very difficult to bring these contending parties together. And I think essentially that's what we've seen in Zimbabwe, that we have a crisis that continuously takes different kinds of cycles. You think that it's over, but all of a sudden, it starts all over again. Why? But because it's ultimately being driven and also being fomented by this deep-seated political polarization that obtains offline before people actually go online. So online, when people go and engage, they've already taken those political identities that they have offline, and they want to defend and push that kind of a narrative online.
Okay, that's interesting. So they already formed their views.
Yeah.
It's like moving slightly to a slightly but perhaps related topic, slightly different but perhaps related. Do you have thoughts on communication surveillance? So particularly, again, in states where there is significant state surveillance, at least on people that the state is interested in, how does social media relate to those things? Because on the one hand, social media is implies a kind of voluntary surveillance. I mean, it's always slightly ironic. Obviously, privacy concerns are important and stuff, but if one is on social media sharing, things, one can choose to do that. And of course, the easiest way to be private is just not to share it. so on the one hand, it creates this vulnerability, but on the other hand, I suppose perhaps it does offer some way for people to control what information is out there about themselves. I mean, I could mislead a surveilling authority by my posts on social media. You know, post a picture of, say, the Bahamas, where you currently seem to be enjoying yourself, and you know, say I'm having a nice time and so forth. Have you got any thoughts on that? And in particular, have people used it, do you know, to avoid being, you know, to mislead the state?
Yeah, thanks a lot again, Alex, for that. I think one thing that comes to mind right now is that surveillance, communication surveillance is a very important subject, especially in repressive states, because oftentimes the government often uses different kinds of, apparatus to engage in this kind of thing. But what we have seen with social media is that on the one hand, social media allows these security apparatus to actually understand what is actually happening or what is being planned. And I think I've got examples again from Zimbabwe, where last time with the Zimbabwean Lives Matter movement, that also gained a lot of traction last year. Most of the so-called ringleaders were actually, arrested, and they were arrested on the basis of the tweets that actually they made online. So it allows these apparatus to actually be able to know what you are planning, if you are planning, especially online, and if actually start having preemptive strategies in terms of dealing with that. So in a way, what I'm saying is that social media allows for police to do what actually police calls predictive policing. So you can actually predict and actually measure what's going to happen and when it's likely to happen, and you then take preemptive measures so that you can deal with it. But on the other hand, social media, by its very nature and its very architecture, also enables what some scholars actually call surveillance capitalism. So which means it also enables private companies or these global companies to actually be able to track and to see our behaviors online. So if I, for example, if I click something and I want to buy a car, all of a sudden I'm bombarded with adverts that are related to cars. Because again, there's already inbuilt surveillance that is already being done through cookies and other things that we engage with almost on a daily basis. So already, because of the architecture of social media, surveillance is something that we cannot run away from. So it enables corporate surveillance on the other hand, but it also enables state surveillance on the other side. But also beyond that, it also even individual surveillance, spouse actually doing surveillance on each other again on social media. So it enables all these kinds of surveillance that actually happen in our everyday life. So that's what I would say for now.
Thank you. That's very interesting, Admire. Okay, we'll come back to that. I had an interesting experience last year. I entered a triathlon, which was subsequently cancelled. And then I went onto Facebook, having done nothing else. And I almost never go onto Facebook. And the first thing it suggested was a chap that I become friends with, a chap who calls himself Triathlon Taryn. I don't know how that got through, but that's very interesting. Let's move on now to talk to Kathleen Stock. Thank you so much, Admire. Kathleen Stock is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sussex in the United Kingdom. In the last 2 years, she's been engaged in public discussions about UK law and policy on sex and gender identity. She writes and speaks publicly from a feminist perspective against policies of self-identification. Professor Stock is a strong proponent of academic freedom to discuss these matters and other matters. Her work has been controversially received. She is the author of Only Imagine, Fiction, Interpretation and Imagination, which is published by Oxford, and Material Girls, set to be published by Fleet in May of this year. She has 37,000 followers on Twitter and uses the platform regularly to disseminate her ideas. So Kathleen, thank you so much for talking to us. I think the big question I want to ask you really is around this sort of aspects of social media as a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, I've seen you use it very effectively to promote a cause that you believe in, and on the other hand, I've seen you be treated quite badly on it, and I just really would be very interested in your reflections on that. Is it how is that experience of, on the one hand, using it effectively, and on the other hand being sometimes being quite badly impacted by it?
Yeah, well, thanks, and thank you very much for having me. Obviously I've got a lot out of. I use Twitter. I don't use any other platform for political activity. I just use Twitter. I've got a lot out of it, and very early on, because I was intervening in a debate that already had substantial public interest in the UK, although academics largely were just kind of ignoring it, or on the other side were being very enthusiastic, but there was a sort of vacuum for an academic there. So I stepped in and immediately had a groundswell of support from people who were members of the public desperate for academics to get involved from my perspective. So that was good, obviously. It really helped. But equally, of course, given I guess, a certain kind of appeal to authority that I could have been seen as making, it attracted a lot of attention for people who wanted me to shut up pretty quickly, and particularly other academics who couldn't believe that I was daring to say the things I was saying. So yes, I've been subject to a lot of, I would say, bad behaviour, defamation, lies, distortion, cherry-picking narratives, stalking, really bad behaviour from academics and from members of the public on social media and off social media. And that has been painful. You'd be crazy to think it wasn't, particularly early on in philosophy, where there's sort of been various waves of it, but early on, when sort of a certain section of my colleagues in philosophy decided that I was beyond the pale, that hurt, because you feel all the feelings of ostracism that human beings feel when they're pushed out of their group and made to feel like they're different. And to have people discussing my abilities, my personality, my character, my morals, all of a sudden, when it's not really part of normal academic discourse to even think about those things, was very shocking. But having said that, in a way, I feel like they've done me a massive favour. If you're going to look at it instrumentally, I wouldn't have so much attention if I didn't have my detractors.
Yeah.
And in a way, I've seen my role as to absorb a lot of aggression and not push it out, so that it becomes very difficult for the public to work out. I just let them most of the time say what they say, and let neutral onlookers observe, and hope that they will then see, look, there is some kind of genuine disagreement here, and maybe go off and find out more about what I think, hopefully finding out that I'm not as bad as they think I am. So I've used it a little bit myself, I think.
Interesting. So and the context for people who aren't familiar, I mean, Kathleen's taken a stance that gets characterized as TERF. I'm new to this, trans exclusionary radical feminist, and that's a social media tag, which is not
I'm not
a fair. It's not radical feminist, depending on.
But I'm not one.
So, which concerns trans, basically the question of how to deal with transsexual people, and particularly women.
I mean, it's not transsexual anymore, but anyway, I'm sure you don't want to know the substantives. I don't want particularly to start arguing for my position, but it's about philosophical definitions of what a woman is.
Exactly.
How they then are articulated in law and policy. And so I'm very much focused on the law and the policy side. I don't really care what people do. If it wasn't about law and policy, I wouldn't be interested.
A bit of background I just wanted to get across was that in academia, by and large, it's very much it has tended to be very much one-sided, which is what you alluded to at the beginning. And so, what you're saying is that you became involved in social media because you, partly because of that. I mean, I guess that's something interesting, which is what the relationship is between social media and academic journals and audiences. I mean, academics do behave quite badly, actually, although it's said that it's only on social media. In fact, in conferences for years, and certainly in philosophy, I mean, there are some very famous philosophers who are horrendous. I've seen rip graduate students to shreds at conferences and stuff. And it perhaps has gotten better, but perhaps hasn't. I don't know. It used to be almost prized by the discipline. And in fact, feminists have played an important role pointing that out in philosophy, at any rate. To some extent. But I guess the question I wanted is how do you deal with, is there a way of dealing with it so that you get the good bits but not the bad bits? Because some of what you describe, I mean, the rules have a gatekeeping effect, which means you can say things on social media you can't say otherwise. And that can be that it enables you to break a stranglehold that you might have felt academia has on a certain view. But it does also mean that people can then start making comments about, your mental abilities, which they just never get published because they're entirely unsubstantiated.
Yes, I mean, I don't actually think that Twitter is a good format for arguing directly. I mean, the character limit makes it impossible. It is a good argument for insulting people, hearing them, lying about them, and so on. So that travels very fast, as I'm sure I don't need to tell people here that the algorithms promote strong articulations of anger, and they fly much faster than sober things with links. But I think yeah. I mean, in the UK, we are encouraged to promote our work on social media. It's called the impact agenda. In fact, what limited funding the government gives us is partly dependent on the impact of our research. So on the one hand, universities want us to do this, but then of course they don't necessarily want us to do it when it turns out that their academics hold positions that embarrass them, which is apparently the state that I'm probably in. So because then it conflicts with all these other agendas like getting student fees. So I think, I don't know if I've got anything very coherent to say, except to say that maybe the thing about that my work is I'm not that interested. I don't know if academics have noticed this, but I'm not that interested in talking to other academics on Twitter.
Yeah.
They talk to each other. When I look at academics on Twitter, I see them talking to each other, often in ways the public can't understand or are not interested in. My engagement is mostly with members of the public and journalists and policymakers and, a huge section of the public, I think, relative to my work. So I just think they're a bit of a distraction. They get very angry with me. Partly, I sometimes think because they want a bit of the attention that I get.
Sure.
But they're a bit of a sideshow. And if I want to engage with academics, I will do it through the journal route. That's where the arguments should happen in that.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the ironies is that people go into academia partly because they don't like the cut and thrust of public debate, or the messiness of public debate, rather, and they want something more refined. But then that does limit your audience to other people who made that same choice.
Yeah.
And I guess I guess one question that just relates to this, as an academic who's used social media, I mean, there is a connection between your academic interests, your intellectual interests, and your use of social media. They're not divorced, even if you're using. So you're still using Twitter to promote an academic agenda as well as a political one. I'd say an intellectual agenda as well as a political one. It's not just so. Even though you're not, so in a sense, it is a kind of an attempt to create or promote public intellectual engagement.
Yeah. I wasn't saying that wasn't the case, but I just think, I mean, there's a hunger in the public to talk to academics, but academics need to learn how to talk to them and not patronize them. Or a lot of the comms that comes out of university on social media has lots of exclamation marks, and it's written in this sort of faux bright, patronizing, childish way to the little people.
Yes.
And it's you can't intellectually engage with it. I find there's a huge audience out there for people who want to get into the ideas, but don't necessarily want to be, I don't know. You just got to find a way of talking to people that they can.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. I also have thought for a long time. I mean, anybody who's taught at university level knows that the majority of your class don't go on to become academics, and it's not the case that the smartest people all become the academics. So. It follows that most smart people are not academics. I think most academics labour under the misimpression they're the smartest people in society, and actually probably not. Okay, thank you. Let's talk to George, to you now. George Ogola is a reader and an associate professor in journalism in the School of Arts and Media at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, in the UK. He's published widely on media, technopolitics, and popular culture in Africa. He's also had a growing interest in public health communication. He's the author of popular media in Kenyan history, fiction, and newspapers as political actors. published by Paul Grove Macmillan, and co-editor of The Future of Quality News Journalism, a cross-continental study published by Routledge with Michael Williams and Peter Anderson. So, George, thank you for joining us. I wonder if we could just start by talking a bit about reflections on social media and Africa, and any regional reflections or differences. I mean, the context of the debates that Kathleen's been involved in is in many ways very sort of global north focused, and it's interesting. I'd be interested to know whether there's a significant differences to the way that social media that you see that operates and in societies, and particularly in the African region, which often isn't particularly highlighted.
Thanks, Alex, and for the invitation. Yeah, I think it's important that we note sort of those differences because I think the narrative is always fairly singular, when in fact in the context in Africa is rather different. I would sort of echo some of the comments made by Admire earlier, that within the context of Africa, where you're talking about sort of information regimes, for example, public information regimes that are tightly controlled by the state, and on occasion even by private media. When talking about sort of such a context, social media sort of provided very important sort of spaces for public conversations and for public sort of deliberation, denied by the state and occasionally by sort of the gatekeeping process or rituals of mainstream sort of private media. And I would argue that whilst social media may not necessarily lead to revolutions in Africa, sort of it creates sort of these very important pockets of indiscipline that somehow sort of puncture the majesty of the state, and I think that is absolutely sort of significant. And we've seen that reflected sort of across the continent. But I think that sort of what you could perhaps consider sort of egalitarian promise of the internet is still sort of a dream deferred. And why do I say this? We might look at sort of the key challenges that face the use of social media in Africa. The issue of internet penetration, for example, the notion of access, which is a big problem that limits, the levels of participation. So, for example, Nigeria has 96%, internet penetration, Kenya 85%, South Africa surprisingly only 57%. And then you look at other countries such as Eritrea, only 6.9%, South Sudan 7.9%, Western Sahara, it's under 5%. So that in itself is a hindrance to making sort of an argument that social media sort of provides sort of this open space for public participation, because that public is actually very, very limited to particular social classes in society. And then, of course, there's the notion of digital literacy. There's always the assumption that once you have access, then you participate, but that is not indeed sort of the case. Digital literacy is quite different. You've got to know, for example, how best to use particular hashtags to promote a particular issue on Twitter. You've got to know how to which people to actually tag. You've got to know how the social media sort of ecosystem actually works to be able to use it meaningfully. Most of the conversations that occur on Twitter, very few develop organically. I sometimes call it a manufactured form of democratic sort of participation, because they're sort of invisible networks that know how to connect with one another that we probably don't pay attention to. And the third point that Admire equally mentioned was the issue of the state, being a very important player in this particular ecosystem, by way, for example, of controlling the infrastructure, being able to shut down the internet when it thinks it should. It has the resources, for example, to use bots to pay influencers. It's always interesting in Kenya, for example, where when an oppositional narrative is trending on Twitter, you give it a few minutes, there will be a pro-government narrative, hashtag, trending at the same time. So the state is a very active player, and it's got the resources to actually undermine those oppositional forces, as well. So whilst we cannot ignore, its role sort of in, nominally sort of expanding the public sphere, we also have to take into account sort of the challenges that sort of undermine the broader public participation.
That's interesting. I think, the points about the different internet penetration, very simple points that are just very often forgotten. And also power is obviously another one. I mean, we currently running this webinar just in case there's a power cut. We have organized in 2 separate locations so that the webinar can keep going if one of them is cut out. So, and obviously South Africa is relatively good for that in that regard. And in some other countries, there's just not even, you can't even necessarily charge a phone, let alone use it. Let me ask you a little bit about social media giants. I mean, I was asking Mare as well about, whether Facebook and Google would have had the same kind of interest in who runs Uganda or whatever it might be. And of course, the answer is I'm sure they don't. But in Asia, there are different social media networks and different platforms. And so far as I know, there aren't many or any prominent African-based social media platforms. So firstly, am I correct in thinking that? And secondly, do you think there are going to be? Do you think it's going to happen, or does it require a much larger internet penetration first?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can understand. We live in a moment of sort of this resurgent sort of nationalism. And one could say that there's perhaps a political appetite for that. Whether that sort of translates into something meaningful by way of sort of starting, an African-based sort of social media platform, I'm not too sure. Whether that would make a substantive difference, perhaps in ensuring sort of a much more substantive engagement with that particular platform. Again, I'm not sure. I mean, social media platform, the tech giants, Facebook, Twitter, they're all sort of interested or invested in some form of control, so that's not going to change. In China, Weibo and the rest, it's all about sort of a control. I think what Africa has been very good at is appropriating and reconfiguring technology to suit sort of their context. That is what is significant. I think that is perhaps where the investment, should be. I mean, I look at, for example, what the way in which social media has been instrumentalized, politically, as I said, across the continent, from Egypt to Tunisia to Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere. And I think that, you can reconfigure that technology to address, local concerns in a very powerful way, rather than attempting to sort of reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So I think that is where the investment, should be. And it's not just, with social media. I mean, I look at Kenya and the way, the mobile phone has been reconfigured, the M-Pesa platform, for example, everybody owns M-Pesa in Kenya, and it's part of the everyday, in that particular country. completely sort of revolutionized the way people transact business. And it is, it's fighting sort of the big banks, in ways that no one could have imagined. And
so this platform allows transactions, commercial transactions, and money transactions. Is that right?
Yes, it does. It does. Among other things, and so I think it's that sort of reconfiguration of existing technology to address local challenges and problems that I think we perhaps need to invest in, rather than sort of attempting to start a new sort of social media platform. Yeah.
Okay, this is very interesting. I wonder maybe we just open this up to a panel discussion now. I wonder if we can maybe I mean, first of all, if any of you wants to say anything that on any of the others have said, feel free to do so. I mean, otherwise, I'd suggest we maybe discuss this question of polarization. Does anybody want to? Oh, Admire's got his hand up. Yes.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I want to just chip in with regards to what George was talking about. For example, I think I want to talk about why is it that probably we don't have an African-based social media, maybe giant, so to speak. I think we used to have, I think you remember in South Africa, it mixed it almost, I think, in its formative years. I think it went as far as Nigeria. I think it was very popular at that time. But of course, I think at the end of the day, for you to have actually a lot of traction around social media, you must be able to penetrate the whole globe rather than just to focus on a few countries, because ultimately you need more takers so that people are on that who are on that network can actually then be able to network with others beyond your own particular boundaries, but also beyond your own continent. I think that is one reason why we don't have one. But I also agree with what George said, that I think it's all about appropriating, reconfiguring it to making sure that it suits our own conditions, it suits our own context. And I think M-Pesa, EcoCash, and all these other mobile platform companies that we have seen over the last couple of years, I think are an example to show that you can actually be able to appropriate some of these technologies and to make them suit our conditions. For example, we know that most people in Africa don't have bank accounts. So, platforms like M-Pesa, EcoCash become very important because they allow people to have their own banks on their mobile phones, and you don't really need to fill in all these other forms that you're supposed to fill in when you go to banks. You don't get to be asked whether you have got an address or you don't when you use those kinds of platforms. So I think that's essentially what we are seeing. It's about the reconfiguration, suiting, actually socially shaping the technology that we have to suit our own conditions. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. It certainly would make sense if the sort of dominant platforms are shaped depending on the interests of the society that gave rise to them. Let me ask about this thing about polarization. I mean, so is it something that's inevitable on social media, or is it something that one could avoid? I know it's a very simple question, but a familiar question. But I wonder to what extent, and whether that can be avoided. I mean, so there's one aspect of it is people's behavior can be different. The other aspect of it is that the platforms themselves might somehow be different. Does any of you have views on or experiences on that? Go for it.
Have a go. I mean, I think clearly people's behaviour could be different, but it probably won't be, because there's no real incentive for an individual to play by some set of rules when you can get so much further and faster by abusing by not playing by the rules. Certainly there's things that people do that just increase polarization all the time. For instance, use mass blocking tools in the area I'm in. So quite a lot of academics are on something called a turf blocker, which removes huge numbers of people from any conversation, potentially, from them, just see that you're blocked. There's that. I should also say that Twitter, in terms of structures, Twitter is banning people with views like mine regularly, which means that they are seeking other platforms. So there's one called Over It, which has started, and there's another one whose name escapes me, and it's very annoying. But in a way, that's not going to help, because, of course, you'll end up with another kind of bubble forming, and bubbles are not good, no matter who's in them. So I think anything that this is a basic point, but anything that the companies could do to break down the bubbles, which in academia are, I think out of control. Just people talking to like-minded people, getting more and more extreme, even amongst academics. Then you can see that it's a big problem, because we're supposed to be, we're supposed to have the tools to escape all those social influences, but we clearly don't.
Yes, no, I certainly feel that way. I mean, it's certainly not. I mean, philosophers ought to be able to deal with disagreement much better than they actually can, in many cases. Not in all. So, I mean, a related thing is to do with the transporting of issues. So one of the issues, so the issues concerning gender, one of the things that's often said about them is that they largely stem from American university campus politics and have moved around different parts of the world. And one might see that happen in Africa as well. And one might see the issues arising there, that particular set of issues arising in African contexts where they're currently very, very, very much not prominent as public issues. I wonder, does that increase the possibility of polarization, and is it again potentially, looking the other way, you could see it as a good thing, like, oh, it's good that people are aware of these issues suddenly that they should have been aware of in the first place? Yes.
Well, sorry, I'll just have a quick
go for it.
It depends whether they're genuine issues there or not. For a start, they can confect issues that are not actually relevant to the situation. So in the debate I'm in about gender identity, this idea of gender identity is now being applied to cultures very distant from the American ones, and societies with traditionally like the Hijiras in India, for instance, and various other kinds of, I don't know what you say, third gender people that have a particular meaning in those societies. They're just being pulled out and pushed into this kind of homogenous group, which is very US centric in its sort of conceptual framing. But I think you can see how it increases polarization amongst Anglophone countries, because we're so dominated by American tech and by American voices. And it was very obvious when 6,000 philosophers signed an open letter against me recently that they didn't even bother to get my view actually right. So I'm talking about a particular issue in UK policy, and the Americans that wrote the letter don't have any interest in the details of UK policy. They don't, so they just mispresented my view, and 6,000 people signed it. So, when we're talking at that level of generality, then details are going to get lost that are really relevant to the local context, which is not going to help.
Well, they also started the letter by saying in the very first sentence that you had been given an award by the Conservative government, which was also quite telling, rather than just the government.
And I wasn't also by government either. I was given it by an independent committee. But
well, exactly. Yes, no, exactly. But it's an interesting, interestingly and obviously very politicized in a very polarized way, a very party political way. So let's talk a little bit about power as well. I mean, it's one of these very obvious questions, but I'm not sure anybody has the answer to it. I mean, who or how should social media be improved and regulated? Who should do the regulating, and how should it be improved, and how could it be? I mean, I think it's inevitable that there are going to be platforms. It's not inevitable that, and it may be inevitable that people are inclined to behave in certain ways, but it's not necessarily, there may be quite a lot of scope for different ways of regulating, and presumably different structures are going to grow up in different conventions, just as they have in print journalism and broadcast journalism and in books and so forth, governing these things. And at the moment, I suppose you're seeing a bit of a conflict between governments and big tech in Australia and America, which create their own risks as well. I mean, does any of you have any ideas about who should be responsible for and empowered to deal with the bad bits of social media, as it were, without necessarily ironing out the good bits?
Can I come in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, Admire mentioned something to do with the idea of surveillance capitalism, and I think that the book was written by Shoshana Zuboff, who makes a very compelling argument, about the fact that the governments around the world sort of left the digital ecosystem to be led by, the tech companies, and then they're trying to sort of catch up. And that it's become very difficult because the tech companies sort of lead the way, and governments then attempt to regulate, that particular environment in which, the tech companies actually operate. And so catching up is quite difficult. And I think that, there's got to be much more sort of longer term thinking about the digital, conversation that involves, both the tech companies, government, states, and indeed sort of the public, to be able to begin to sort of understand and perhaps come up with sort of an infrastructure that benefits, everybody, in some way. Tech companies are commercial enterprises. They will always be interested in some form of control that, makes them money. States, on the other hand, are equally, interested in some form of control. So they have a shared interest in control. It's just the different forms of control that they're interested in. But I think equally, what sort of reflecting on is the idea of why social media platforms, particularly in the context of Africa, why are they becoming so popular? There's something about journalistic sort of practices, and media organization, the way media organizations operate in the continent, that have over time excluded, people, through perhaps, the journalistic rituals, through, gatekeeping processes that tend to privilege, particular voices at the expense of the others. So the move towards, the digital platforms was always going to be inevitable. As long as you're excluded from, a particular platform, you'll always want to have a voice elsewhere. So I think it's equally incumbent upon, mainstream news organizations to begin to introspect, on their own sort of practices and how these are sort of pushing people away, from them. Why those alternative social media platforms are actually becoming that more sort of popular. They've got the resources. Why are people pulling away? So they've got to address, this form of exclusion that have been institutionalized over time.
Of course, that's in many ways that's what that line that is almost verbatim what the sort of Trump supporter would say as well, which is very interesting. Admire, you've got your virtual hand up.
Thanks a lot, Alex. I just want to add a few things. I think one thing that is also coming to the fore, especially now, is that most governments are trying to control, not trying to regulate an animal that they don't understand. And I think that's the most unfortunate part of it, because the governments don't have the technical expertise to understand how these companies actually operate. And at the end of the day, their regulation is always lagging in terms of trying to deal with it. And we are seeing it now with the way how these tech companies actually operate, that the government don't understand the nature of the beast. And if they don't understand the nature of the beast, chances are that they are not going to be able to tame them in as much as they will try to do that. And also the other thing that I just want to add was that I think what has just been said by George is that certainly the popularity of social media says a lot about the state of the media in Africa. And I think the one thing that is actually coming to the fore is that most ordinary voices, most ordinary voices are not reflected in our media, in our media products. And as a result, the journalism that we see is very elitist. And actually, some actually have said it's the views from the suburbs in some instances. And because of that, all of a sudden, social media allows the ordinary person to have their views and their voices out there, which were excluded and which were marginalized and were trampled upon by mainstream journalistic practices. So that's why some scholars even have said that we shouldn't talk about the media. When we talk about the media in Africa, we should talk about the media in Africa and not African media. Because once we say African media, we assume that African voices are being captured through that media. Rather, let's say it's media that actually is just based in Africa, but it doesn't propagate ideas and values of Africans. And that becomes very important. And then one last thing that I just want to say is that some scholars have also argued that we need to, instead of focusing more on these corporate social media companies that we have, rather let's have what we would probably call a public service social media companies, almost like your public broadcasting companies like your SABC. But now this one is done almost like it's almost like it's got a board of directors that runs it. but it's independent of the state. But we've also seen with how it's very difficult to have an independent board that runs public service company, service broadcasting companies. And again, that would also create a lot of problems in terms of governing these kinds of companies. So I would say that there's no one size fits all strategy going forward, but I think we need to do something about it rather than just allow Facebook to say they've got their own oversight board that is going to dictate how they are going to operate. I think that would be wrong, certainly going forward. That's what I would say.
Kathleen.
Yes, I just wanted to observe, building on what Admire and George just said about the relationship between social media and the media, that in the UK, there's a similar conflict, I think, really between universities and the general public. And you can see it in differing attitudes to Brexit. So 51% of the population in the UK voted for Brexit, and yet that view is not represented in British universities. There's most university academics are of the left, but it's a specific version of the left that's quite liberal, that's quite cosmopolitan, that's quite sort of, I don't know, metrosexual. And it's not necessarily chiming with the public mood at the moment. So there is a sort of moving away, I think, or a splitting or a polarization between these two sectors in society. And social media is a place where potentially they could come together in interesting ways. Now, of course, if they're only talking to each other, and if they've blocked all the Brexiteers and the TERFs or whatever, then they're not going to. But I do think there is it's quite interesting and potentially beneficial, this kind of democratization of the public voice in this area, specifically in relation to academia and also the left press as well. But that's a separate issue.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. I think we're going to wind it up there, but that's a very interesting point to end on, because there is a very clear, in my mind anyway, very clear commonality between that theme in the Western stroke global Northern discourse, where you have this sort of media that is conscious of not necessarily, and perhaps political class, but is conscious of not necessarily reflecting what a lot of actual people think and feel strongly. And in the African context, again, a lot of disaffection with media, and in the African context, with often with the state as well. I think that's a very interesting point to end on. So I just want to briefly mention 2 or 3 things that are coming up. Tomorrow we have a reading group on the philosophy of artificial intelligence that some of you might want to join, called, we're reading a paper called Can Robots Do Epidemiology on Machine Learning, Causal Inference and Predicting the Outcomes of Population Health Interventions. On the 29th of March, we've got a public lecture organized by the Data Science Cross Disciplines Research Group, and that is called Robot of Robots, Hyper-Automation for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And then on the 13th of May is the next panel discussion of this nature, roughly speaking of this nature. It'll be actually a bit longer, and that will be concerning philosophy of medicine and COVID-19. But I want to make sure we finish on time, or even before. So thanks very much to all of you. I really enjoyed that. And I'm really grateful that you were able to give up your time. We will post a video which had been edited, mildly, not to make people say something different, but mildly edited video. And we'll share the link quite soon. Our website isn't quite up yet, but it will be before too long. So we'll share that soon. But thanks to all of you again. Thanks again also to Anthony and Caitlin, who were central in organizing this. Much appreciated.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.